Thank you, Lori and Esther. It's really so thrilling to be here, and I was so excited when Oolite did their residency at MoCA, and I got to meet those artists and get a chance to know a little bit more about what's going on here in Miami. So I'm thrilled to be back. It's interesting, I spend a lot of time giving talks on the projects I do, but not on why I do what I do. And so it was actually a really lovely invitation for Lori to say to me, like, don't make this your average talk where you just go through all your shows. So I really sort of thought long and hard about why I curate and how I curate. At one point, I was doing a lecture at UT Austin about curating. This was years ago, so you're not getting the same one, don't worry. But I Google image searched Curator, and these were the first two images that came up. And I just cracked up because I was like, the internet thinks a curator is like a moody European white dude or a lady with kooky jewelry. And I was like, I'm not either of those things. So what does it mean for me to be a curator? I would say that I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be in the arts. This is maybe one of the most personal slides I've ever created. This image here is of my grandfather. And he used to make these, he was an artist. After many years of working in shoe factories, when he retired, and aside from taking care of 3 kids, his 3 grandkids, me included, he made art. And these are these meticulously beaded pictures that he would sit, he was legally blind, and he would sit there, and I just saw this complete need to create from an early age. When I was a kid, I took art classes, the far image, at a museum called the Fuller Museum of Art in Brockton, Massachusetts. And that will come back around again. And then when I went to college, actually, back up, it was at the Fuller Museum of Art that I realized I wanted to be a curator. I went there on a senior high school field trip, and I didn't know what a curator was. I was on the path to being an artist, but I kind of always knew I didn't have the drive to be an artist. I loved the act of creating, but I didn't have to make art. And so I went to the Fuller on this field trip, and we met the curator, and I remember thinking to myself at 17, wow, that's a job I think I'd be good at. I think I'd be good at helping artists make things. And I kind of never turned back. And when I graduated from high school, I went to Brandeis University, and I dropped my bags off at the dorm, and I marched my 18-year-old self over to the art museum, the Rose Art Museum, and said, I would like a job, please. And they looked at me like I was crazy, and they said, we don't have any internships at the moment. And I said, you don't need to pay me, I just want to learn. And then they let me in. You know how much art museums love free labor, especially in the early 90s. So it was a very small staff, and I just worked with everybody. But I particularly worked with this gentleman in the lower middle picture. His name was Carl Bells. He was the director of the Rose Art Museum, and he taught me how to not give a fuck about what the art world thinks. And that is how I still hold that really dear. He was a museum director like no other. I remember he would call me into his office and tell me to grab 2 chairs, and we'd walk into the vault, and I'd pull out a rack, and we would just talk about art together while he smoked Lucky Strikes in the vault. And he just loved artists. He loved being around them. He loved supporting them, and he loved art, and that was just unparalleled to me. I remember when I was getting ready to graduate, I told him I thought I should go to grad school. He said, I'll write you a letter, and I ended up going to the curatorial program at Bard. Before that, my senior year, one semester at when I was at Brandeis, I said, well, I've worked at the Rose. I should have an experience somewhere else. I tried a commercial gallery. I lasted 3 weeks when I was like, oh, not for me. And then I went and did an internship at the Fuller Museum and worked with a curator there, Jennifer Atkinson, for one semester. And when I got out of Bard, I didn't have a job. This was in the late 90s. Bard was a very young program then. And I remember most of the cohort that I went to school with, they went to New York. And I said, I have a feeling that if I go to New York, I'm going to spend a decade getting somebody's coffee. So I'm not going to do that. And so I went back to visit the curator I worked with at the Fuller. Carl had already retired from the Rose at that point. And that curator had just been named the director, and she said, do you want my old job? And so I became a curator, and all the other students in my year were like, wait, you're doing what? And again, I think it's really because you choose your own path. I've always been a firm believer that there is an art world that is presented to you, but there are many art worlds, and you get to make your own. And so that is what I did. And when I went to the Fuller, the bug that caught me the hardest was commissioning new work. I loved putting together group shows. I loved that kind of exercise of thinking. But to be able to work with an artist from nothing to something was really what became my passion. This is the first project I ever commissioned, and this was in 2001 with Mark Dion. And Mark had never shown in Massachusetts before, which is where he grew up. And we ended up doing a project called the New England Digs, which we did 3 fake archaeological digs in my hometown, his hometown, and Providence. And I was in there, in the dirt with him, sifting through things to find all of these instances of material culture. And I think it was then that I realized that curator doesn't quite get it. I love that curator comes from the word care, but I've never been so interested in the sort of power dynamics of tastemaking. So I often like to say I work much more as a producer. So if you think of typical film production, that is how I like to approach my work. It's a sort of all in and get your hands dirty. There's also artists that I work with multiple times. This is another project I did with Mark, which was in Pennsylvania. And he wanted to, at first, build an archive of all the cemeteries in this area. And the state archivist wouldn't let him rub the headstones to do rubbings. And so he said, well, I'm just going to build my own. And so we built a graveyard, and he and I pretty much single-handedly built this dry stack stone wall. And I remember we got all of these rocks delivered to us, and we were lugging these rocks, and I was like, we need some help. So the organization I was working with said, we've got volunteers coming for you on Saturday. And a bus showed up, and out came about 25 8-year-old Girl Scouts who could not lift the rocks. So Mark and I went to the high school the following Monday and got the football team. And then I worked with Mark again at MoCA, where we presented his Octagon Room, which is basically functions as a mini retrospective of his career. So to me, curating is also about relationship building. Mark and I have known each other now for 25 years, and it's just that thing that continues to grow. I've always thought about exhibition making in some non-traditional ways. When I was, after I left the Fuller, I was at Art Space in New Haven, and and one of my shows that I did there was actually started by an artist, Michael Oatman, who did a project in Troy, New York called Factory Direct, where he put artists in residence in area factories to make work. And when I got to New Haven, I said to him, do you want to do a second version of Factory Direct? And he said, I curated once, I'm not a curator, but you do it. and I want to be in it. So we did one. So the top image is actually a Mark Dion installation from the Troy Factory Direct. This lower image is from the one we did in New Haven, where I put 12 artists in residence in 12 Connecticut factories. And the whole idea around it was, if you think about most smaller factories, they start in the same way that an artist starts in their studio. They start with an idea of innovation, the kind of drive to do something that may seem crazy to other people, and a kind of just like outside of the box thinking. And now a lot of factories move away from that, and this was a way to bring artists in to sort of reinvigorate that kind of creative economy for them. And they were amazing projects. My intern on that project was an amazing arts person named Eric Scheiner, who later went on to be the director of the Warhol Museum, among many other places. And when he was in Pittsburgh, he did a third version of Factory Direct. So I love these kind of through lines and the way that they build these communities over time. The last show I did at Art Space in New Haven was also a really unusual one. And this was at a moment when the Board of Tourism and the Arts Council merged. And we were all like, so hotel might be applying for the same kinds of funding that an art museum is. So we decided to invite a number of artists to submit proposals about art and tourism. And the proposal that we chose was by Chris Doyle, who then turned over the idea, which he called 50,000 Beds. And we commissioned 45 artists to do short films in hotels, motels, and inns across the state of Connecticut. Got all of those hotels to give us one night for free per artist. And they had to make their video in one night in the hotel rooms. And it was then the exhibition, I was like, if this is talking about the whole state, it can't just be at one venue. So we collaborated with Real Artways in Hartford and the Aldrich in Ridgefield. And to see the entire show, you had to travel to each venue because they were all up simultaneously. So again, this kind of really expansive notion of how to sort of put art into the world. Then, I got to Mass MoCA, and I started to really dig into these ideas. And this notion of like a producer or facilitator is really about, again, supporting artists. Sometimes that means a daily ritual. So one of the first pieces I commissioned at Mass MoCA was from Nina Kachadorian, and it was a piece called Falls Colors, which is a pun on false colors, where she made an artificial tree branch stuck to a real tree in permanent fall colors. She said, it's like somebody who gets the dress code right to the party once in a while. But every day for a year on my way to work, I photographed that tree at her bequest. And so she has this incredible archive, and here you see it sticking out and blending in. And I'm sort of of the mind of no ask is too big or too small. It's what an artist needs. So when I got to Mass MoCA, I really got to push this into the next level. We've always thought of Mass MoCA as a place where we make with artists. We have incredible production facilities. And one of the best things I ever had an artist say to me was Trenton Doyle Hancock, who of course has shown at Locust Projects. And he once said to me, I heard Mass MoCA made artists' dreams come true, but I didn't know they made dreams come true you hadn't dreamt yet. And that to me was like the biggest compliment I could ever get. Because really what I like to do is take leaps of faith with artists and give them prompts that maybe they've never gotten before and give them opportunities. So this was the first project I commissioned at Mass MoCA with Inigo Manglano Ovalle. And he said, I've always wanted to, I've worked with Mies van der Rohe architecture before, but I've never built my own. And I said, let's do it. And so he had this idea to rebuild the 50 by 50 house, which was a house that Mies designed that was never built. And we couldn't fit 50 by 50 even in our biggest gallery because it's only 50 feet wide. So we built a bachelor pad version, which was 25 by 25 feet. And we worked with the original engineers at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill who worked with Mies, and we made this house happen. And so it was an incredible mix of, like, the top image is a fabrication studio in Chicago where Inigo is based that made the framework. And then we made all the furniture on the inside. We put the whole thing together to create this kind of stunning work. And that's just sort of, we don't blink an eye. That's just how we do. I love sort of thinking, you know, so many of my projects that I work on, I start, like I said, you start from nothing. I start from maybe knowing an artist, getting to know an artist. These are often 3 to 5 year engagements, sometimes more. I always say those first year or two is just getting to know each other. If we don't get to the point where we deeply trust one another as humans, it's never going to work. Making art and making art with a team is so vulnerable. So I need to get to the point where if I have a suggestion or anything, that the artist trusts that I'm not doing it for any reason other than to help them make that project better. So I had done a project with Neri Ward back in 2003. And it was a bit of a disaster. It was a public art project, and it was, long story, you can ask me in the Q&A. And I always said to him, when I go somewhere else, we're gonna do something bigger. And so when I got to MoCA, he was one of the first people I asked. And I love showing this because I love that sort of sketch to completion. And he had this idea that he wanted to talk about both North Adams as a manufacturing city and then his home in Jamaica. So his original idea was to make this giant sculpture based on a fish trap. So I knew he was thinking about that. And then one day, one of my colleagues came up to me and they showed me a picture on their phone jokingly and said, "Want a boat?" And I said, "Yes." And they were like, "Are you kidding?" And I was like, "It's free." And I was like, "Where is it?" And they were like, "In Williamstown, the next town over." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I'd like that boat." They're like, "It's not seaworthy." I was like, "Oh no, I don't need it to be." And Neri had not asked for a boat. And so this is what I mean about you know each other, so you speak a same language. I knew Neri would want this boat. And so I showed him the picture and I did the same thing. I said, "Want a boat?" And he said, "I can have it?" And I was like, "Yep." So next thing you know, in the dead of winter, we were excavating a boat. There it is at MoCA. When we got it on campus, it had been outside for about 7 or 8 years. When we got it on campus and did all the measurements, we realized it was 1.5 inches too big to get through our biggest roll-up door. So this, I mean, the problem solving, and that's why, again, I go to producer rather than curator, because like that problem solving is so much a part of it. It's like part of my favorite thing about what I do. It's like, how do you like make the impossible happen? So we're like, we got to get this boat in. So we cut it into 3 pieces, but that of course meant, and I don't do this alone. I never do any of this alone. I have the most remarkable team of artists and fabricators and thinkers that I've ever worked with. But they built a whole metal structure inside so that the boat wouldn't just fall apart. And then we managed to crane each smaller piece in the room to this final result. When we were getting the pieces in place, he wanted them to make them feel like they were floating. I remember our director, Joe Thompson, who was the director at that time, he loved to get his hands dirty as well. And so he was in there in the galleries with us, holding a rope as we got these pulleys and we're trying to get this boat up, and there's not enough power to lift. And anybody who came by, patron, staff member, he was like, "Come and grab a rope." And we all did it together. There was also a kind of harrowing moment where when we were building the fish trap, there was a sort of brace inside. And at about 3 a.m, the night before the opening, we finally went to pull out the brace while our head of fabrication and the director of the museum were inside, and the whole sculpture started to collapse. Luckily, we still had it up on a chain fall, so I didn't kill them. So this is really what we do. When I talk about that kind of not giving a fuck about what the art world thinks, this to me is a prime example of that. Everybody in the art world knows Nick Cave's work. It sort of became ubiquitous, his sound suits, incredible. And I thought, I wonder if he's tired of making those. And so I went to his studio in Chicago. I had met him once for like a minute at an opening. And I went to his studio in Chicago, and we were doing the thing, and he finally says, "Okay, what do you have in mind?" And I said, I unrolled the floor plan of our gallery called Building 5, which is the length of a football field, 50 feet wide and 25 feet high. We always give that to a single artist for a new commission. So I opened the floor plan and I said, "This and not a single sound suit." And everybody said to me, "Was like, you said that to him?" And I was like, if he said no, then I knew I wouldn't want to work with him. And so he paused, and then he just looked at me and he said, "Ooh, girl, thank you." And I was like, oh, we're gonna have fun. And then what I often do with artists in that moment, I say, take the next year. I'm here whenever you need it, but I'm also not here whenever you need it. And think about what you want to do, and then I'll come back. And so I went to the studio a year later, and he presented the idea for this project called Until. And this is just some of the making. This was a project that 90% of it was fabricated on site at MoCA. Nick works very intuitively. He almost never draws. The fact that I got that drawing out of him was a miracle. And so he would come back and forth and work with our team to build this structure. And he had this dream. And in the dream, he thought, is there racism in heaven? And he wanted to build a sculpture that would be a place for gathering, a place for uplifting. There are some things that, I don't blink an eye at doing. And then in retrospect, I'm like, I did that. Why did I do that? One of the ones in this show was the sort of keepers of that cloud were 14 cast iron blackface lawn jockeys. And Nick uses these racist objects often to both pull them out of circulation and to give them new meaning. And I remember right around Christmas, there was one that he really wanted. You have to buy these on eBay, and you have to wonder about who you're buying them from. There was one he really wanted, and it was in Boston, and it was pickup only. And my family's from Boston, so I was like, I'll get it around the holidays. And I went to this person's house, and they had a sign on the front door that said white trash. And I and they just put it outside, and I put it in my trunk, and I threw a blanket over it. And I pulled down to the end of the driveway to call a friend who I was meeting up with, and they came running out and yelling at me and asking me who I was, and I actually had to utter the phrase, "I bought the lawn jockey." It was a very weird moment of life. But Nick wanted it, so I had to get it for him. This was the one piece that was made at his studio, these beaded curtains. But what I loved is because his studio, we turn our galleries into studios. Nobody has as much room as our galleries have, even in our shop. We can't see things complete. So we do very long installs so that you can just sort of keep making. And this was the one moment all of his studio assistants who worked on these beaded curtains saw them in full for the first time, which was amazing. My other favorite story revolves around these crystals. And so Nick wanted to create this, what he called a crystal cloud. And, I've never helped an artist build a crystal cloud before, so I didn't know how many crystals that would take. Turns out it's 10 miles. But they come in with jump hooks and strands. And so they had to be all different lengths. At one point, we wiped out all the crystals in the United States, and I'm sure pissed off a bunch of brides. I apologize to the anonymous wedding planners. But at one point, I was like, crystals are expensive. And, I don't like to say no to artists. I always say I only say no if the work is going to hurt somebody. it's going to permanently ruin the structural integrity of the building, or I really can't figure out how to afford it. I can usually figure out how to afford it. And with Nick, I learned that you can make shortcuts as long as it doesn't look like you have. So my assistant at the time, now one of our incredible curators, Ali Fortis, asked Nick, can some of them be plastic? And he said, yeah, 75% can be acrylic, the remaining 50% should be glass. And she said, but Nick, that's 125%. And without skipping a beat, he said, exactly. And so on my left index finger is tattooed 125%. Again, another sort of, how do you make the dream the reality? When I first met Trenton Doyle Hancock, I said, I want to know what the inside of your brain looks like. And his dear friend and gallerist said, uh-oh. And a year later, he was like, oh, you're fine. You guys get each other. And I asked Trent if he ever wanted to make his characters inhabitable. And so he imagined this entire sort of Candyland-esque world. And we built it. We built giant mounds. One was actually made here in Miami that came to Locust. Hi. And it was just so incredible to watch this happen. And to watch Trent, you know, this is the house in the front is a replica of his grandmother's house. And the first night of installation, he slept inside there. He then the next morning was like, that was weird. But we let him do it, and it was just this incredible moment. So I love that sort of dream making. This is Glenn Kino, who I worked with for about 5 years to conceive of this project called In the Light of a Shadow. It actually ended up being 6 years because this thing called COVID happened. And it's interesting because this, I think when you're a more traditional curator, it's really hard to pivot because you have the thing set in your head. And when you're working with living artists and you're working with new works, you have to know how to be really light on your feet. So just before the pandemic, I'd been at Glenn's studio, and this model was some of the sculptures that he was going to make. They were all very touch interactive. And then the pandemic hit, and we were like, well, not only can you not come here and work with my team, we can't make stuff that people need to touch. So it was kind of brilliant. He and I got on the phone. We're like, how do we keep people engaged? And, you know, Zoom was still an exciting thing then. I think less so now. But we started to get our team and his team together on Zoom. And he would send ice cream to everybody's house. He tried to send beer, but you can't do that in Massachusetts. And he gave everybody an assignment, which was make a rock. People are like, what? What do you mean make a rock? And he was like, you know, there's rocks outside, but what would it look like? How would you make a rock? And these were some of the examples. Like, I love the bottom one, where on the left is a rock, and on the right, this guy Tavish made a rock out of leaves. And it was all this sort of, he was like, we weren't ever going to use a rock made of leaves. We were going to actually use real rocks, which we did, but this was this way of getting people to think about these things and to stay connected and to stay engaged. So this was part of the final project. This was one that happened during COVID, and also, again, that nimbleness means you have to be reactive to the world. So when George Floyd was murdered, there was a protest in LA, and there was a young man at that protest named Dion Jones, who worked for Glenn. And Dion was shot in the face with a rubber bullet at point blank range. And if the rubber bullet had hit him an inch to the left, he would have been dead. Dion always wanted to be a singer. Glenn's show was about the alignment between the US and the Northern Irish civil rights movements, and essentially the history of protest and revolution. So as part of that, we always intended to remake the song Sunday Bloody Sunday. And so originally we were gonna get Common and Bono to sing it together. But then when this happened to Dion, we knew what to do. And I remember Glenn calling me and he said, you know who needs to sing it? And I was like, it's Dion. And so Glenn, once Dion was healed enough, Glenn put together a band of people that included Steve Albini, who produced Nirvana's Nevermind, John Baptiste, Glenn Kochi from Wilco, and we created a new video and a new version of Sunday Bloody Sunday. And all the proceeds at the time went to Stacey Abrams charities. And Dion later then sued the LAPD and historically won. And then this was the final show called In the Light of a Shadow, which was a sort of 30-minute experiential shadow play about the history of protest and revolution. Other things that I do is sort of think about how to act as an editor, an interpreter, and an advocate. Sometimes when artists are in it, it's hard to see outside of it, and that is part of my job. But things like bringing people together. It's one of my favorite things to do. These first two images were when I was asked to curate similar residencies. So the middle one was at Art Pace in San Antonio, where you pick 3 artists to do residencies and then an exhibition. And then this one is in Pittsburgh at the Mattress Factory, a similar idea. And you know, they're not considered a group show. So you could pick 3 artists who are very different. But for me, it was really important to choose artists that in those residency environments could learn from each other, could support one another, and whose work had sort of linkages. And so all of the people who ended up doing these ended up being fast friends. One of my favorite moments was that the person who's right next to me in that photo, an artist named Katie Bullock, I met when she was 20, and she came to me as a intern, and not an intern, sorry, she was a studio assistant for an artist. Then she was my intern, then she was my student, and now she's an artist I got to exhibit. And I actually have a tattoo that she drew for me. So it's about that bringing together. The far image at the end was when I was helping set up a residency program at the SETI Institute, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And sort of going back to that idea of factory direct, of like how artists can allow researchers in other fields to see their work from different angles. That's so true of the sciences. And that was an extraordinary program that allowed these artists to have access to these incredible scientists, both at SETI and NASA. Sometimes it's helping an artist edit. This is Tanya Hollander, who did this incredible project with me in 2017. I first showed Tanya's work at the Fuller Museum, called Are You Really My Friend?, where she went around the world and photographed all 621 of her Facebook friends in real life. And this was a huge project, which you can see. She collected every bit of ephemera. She had snapshots. And so her and I really worked together on how do you hone this mass of information and make people understand the amount of information, have parts of it that are overwhelming, and then parts of it that can be sort of spacious and quiet. So this was us sort of figuring out the overwhelming parts. It's also working with artists, again, over time. Laurie Anderson sometimes refers to me as her forever curator. I've been working with Laurie. We have a long-term space dedicated to her for 15 years, of which we are 5 years in. And you know, we get to do amazing things, from new work to recreating old work. Again, it's just this, it's relationship building. That is like, relationship building and therapy are really what it means to be a curator-producer. This was an incredible project with Sarah Oppenheimer that was 7 years in the making. And for me, I'm really interested, this project was really interesting because it was an active translation. So here's her project at the Wexner on this side. And she said, you know, I always do these site-specific projects, but I always think of them as site-sensitive rather than specific, meaning that there are certain elements that could get moved, but I've never been asked to do it. So I said, well, let's try it. And so of course, with Sarah, because the work is quite specific, moving it often means remaking most of it, but we beautifully recited and refabricated this piece at MoCA. And so again, that kind of hearing an artist say, I've always wanted to do X, and saying, well, then let's go. This was Martin Puryear's Big Bling, which was commissioned by Madison Square Park. I also love to save things. This was in Madison Square Park, then it went to Philadelphia, and then it was due to be destroyed because there was no venue for it. And I found out about that the day that they were taking it down in Philadelphia, and I called Martin and I said, we want it. He was like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, I don't know where we're gonna put it yet, or how we're gonna like make the right space for it and pay to install it, but like, we want it. And he said, this is a stay of execution. And so we brought the piece to MoCA, and it took us about a year to raise the money and find the site. And what was also really beautiful about that, you can see it at MoCA on the far image, is we put in a public park, which our city does not have a lot of. And even though we own the property, it is a completely public park. And the community has embraced this piece so much. And there was no public art in downtown North Adams. And now I remember one day driving past this kind of like, make your own t-shirt, tchotchke shop, and they had a Big Bling t-shirt in the window. And I was like, oh, we did that right. This is another talking about facilitating project that I'm super excited about that you guys are getting a sneak preview on because we haven't publicly announced it, which is a program that Christy Edmonds, our current director, and I conceived of called the Curatorial Exchange Initiative. And that is a 3-year fellowship with this incredible group of BIPOC curators who are going to come in and curate exhibitions at MoCA. I'm so thrilled to be working with these folks over the next few years. You know, I've been at MoCA for 16 years, our curator, Allie, 10 years, our curator, Susan, 17 years. And I remember when Christy got there, I said, you know, I'm not tired of curating here, but we need some new voices. It's been the same voices for a long time. And so many curators don't get the opportunity to work with the kind of freedom and scale that MoCA offers. So I can't wait. They just sent me all their proposals, and these things will start rolling out in the next year and over the next few years. So all of these headlines are certainly like all interchangeable. So this is where I talk about, you know, the getting my hands dirty. This is my team. Some of these people have left, but most of them are still there. And we've been doing these department retreats with each other. I'm definitely a department leader who doesn't like to do things on my own, doesn't think I should do things on my own. And so there's a lot of conversation about how we can do better. How we can do better by ourselves, by the museum, for our artists. And it's an incredible, this is the entire visual arts team for MoCA. Just to put it in perspective, we have 300,000 square feet of exhibition space. And this is the team that does it all. It's extraordinary, and they are rock stars. This was, you know, just again, how do you take care of people? You buy them beer at the end of the day. You get them candy when they're pulling apart 10 miles of Nick Cave crystals. You jump in. This was a project with Lee Borison that we had to do all of this sewing, and you know, that's me in the foreground. I don't know how to sew. I pinned a lot of things, but I did not sew anything because that I would have ruined the art. So also know your limitations. This story, oh, Neri Ward, I love him so much, and he tortured me in a funny way. So when he was conceiving of this piece called The Mango Tourists, which I believe showed at the Perez when his retrospective came around, he said, I want to make these sort of giant snowmen, And they're dotted with those plastic things or capacitors, which are what were made in the factory that MoCA sits in now. And he said, and the other thing I want to put in there are mango pits. And I was like, okay. So I put my intern on a research project, and she found the National Mango Board, and they donated us a pallet load of mango pits. And anybody who's cut up a mango knows it's fibrous. It's not like it comes off clean. And I was like, what do we do with these slimy, rotting things? And so we did lots of different experiments, from like leaving them in vats of bleach. And finally I was like, I was taking them home and experimenting at home. And I finally hit on you boil them, and then you can scrape them, and then you have to bake them in the oven to dry them. We did not have a stove or an oven at MoCA that we could use, and so I did these at home until it got to the point where I was like, I cannot do this anymore. Everybody says, mangoes smell so good. Just remember, rotten, boiled, baked. They do not smell good at that point. I remember going up, my kitchen is on the first floor, my bedroom is on the third floor, and being like, I still smell them. And so we got a stove and put it in our art fabrication shop so that we could dry all of these. And of course, Neri put them in the sculpture, and they blended in. And he was like, isn't that funny? And I was like, I'm gonna kill you. And then he said we should have mango salsa at the opening. But seriously, I love this piece so much, and I wouldn't have done it any other way except get the stove for the shop sooner than I did. This was Teresita Fernandez. This was an installation that she's done a number of times before, but never at this scale, called Sfumato Epic. These are all tiny pieces of graphite, and this was a team of installers that we had working on it because there were tens of thousands of these. I stepped away for a moment to take this photo, but I was right in there. Anybody who's worked with graphite knows that it's everywhere. I would go home at night and I'd be like, how is it in my shoes? I would blow my nose. How is it in my nose? It's just everywhere. But it was, what also happens in these moments is this incredible camaraderie. We were all in it together, and Teresita was in it with us. We often get to those points where we don't have those divides. We're just doing it, which is super exciting. This was a film by Pavel Wojtaszek, which was shot in New Orleans using this panoramic camera. And this was the first time where the maker in me was called out again. So we were filming over the course of about a year, very many different places in New Orleans. And we were filming in Mardi Gras, and our second camera person dropped out. And so we're there, and he just goes, all right, here. And all of a sudden, I was the second camera person. And I was like, no. I find the sights, I find the people, I do the things, I don't hold the camera. And he was like, you're fine. So, that, again, just sort of stepping in when you need to. Researching and exploring are one of my all-time favorite things to do. This is, I do it with artists, I do it on my own. I am a research nerd. I love to delve into every topic. I'm also a firm believer that art shouldn't just look at art, that it has to sit in the world. I used to get in trouble in graduate school for quoting song lyrics and literature instead of critical theory and philosophy. But I did it anyway, even though they yelled at me every single time. This was a research trip I took with Glenn Kino. We barely knew each other then. And this is how we learned each other, is we went to Northern Ireland together. And this is us in Ireland and Northern Ireland. This is a group I often work with called the Metabolic Studio, who are based in Los Angeles. And they do photography as a land-based practice. And they have this incredible device called the liminal camera, which is a shipping container strapped to a flatbed truck, which is a mobile camera obscura and darkroom. And I'd been looking at their work for years, and they just on a whim said, oh, you want to come out on a trip with us? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, no curator's ever said yes. And I was like, well, why wouldn't they? This sounds fun. And I have a background in photography. So we took the camera to the Owens Valley, which is at the base of the Sierra Nevadas. And they photographed this place called the Owens Lake there, which is the lake where the LA aqueduct starts and brings all the water to Los Angeles and pretty much decimated this lake bed. But you can see this kind of pink brackish water. They worked with a scientist who discovered that there's an extremophile bacteria in that water, see, research nerd, that serves as fixative. And so we went there and we photographed the landscape by day, developed the photos in the camera, went to dinner, and then in the dead of night buried the photographs in the lake to let them fix overnight and unearth them the next morning. Probably my biggest and earliest mega research project was this little show I did called Oh Canada. I actually proposed it in my job interview at MoCA. Our director said, what kinds of shows would you like to do if you came here? And I said, I think we should do a big show of Canadian art. And he said, that sounds great, why? And I said, because I think it would be funny. And he was like, what, because Canadians are funny? I was like, well, that too, but I was like, also because it's a kind of fuck you to the art world. You know, why do I know more artists from China than I do from our nearest neighbor? You know, I could have gone to Mexico, it would have been a lot warmer. But, you know, I'm in northern United States, so I went north. And also when I did some research, I realized there hadn't been like a biennial in Canada in more than a decade. This was a country that wasn't looking at itself either. And so I embarked on an epic research project that took me to 400 studios in about 2.5 years in every province and one of the 3 territories. That's me on a snowmobile in the Yukon in February. That was the only way to get to a studio visit. We had to drive across the ice road, the frozen lake, and then get on the snowmobile. I also did a 14-hour studio visit to try to get to the Arctic Circle, only to be thwarted by a snowdrift 20 miles from the Arctic Circle. That's me and our former director, Joe Thompson, in the Prime Minister's office. And yes, I did sit on the desk. There was also nothing on that desk. This was Stephen Harper. There wasn't even a pen there. I thought it was a fake office, but they assured me it was real. And one of the things, people ask me how I find my artists, and I say, sure, I talk to curators, I talk to gallerists, and whenever I get recommendations from those folks, I will look them up, I will do my due diligence, I will make my choices. Whenever I get a recommendation from an artist, I always go. Artists don't give those recommendations out lightly, and so I know they mean it, and I know they know me and that they will like it. So I ended up choosing 63 artists. That was a big show. And it was incredible. It was like the whole of Canada came to North Adams. People still talk about it. I remember when the Canadians came. This was in 2012. And I've since worked with a number of other Canadians who weren't in this show. And it was just like an incredible amount of research. I also realized when I went in to write about this, I was like, I don't know anything about Canadian art history. They don't teach that. And so I went back and taught myself Canadian art history. It was just, and Canadian history. It was just endlessly fascinating to the point where for a good 5 or 6 years afterwards, I got asked all the time if I was Canadian. And I was like, no, I'm just a big fan. This was one of the projects. Aaron Foster, who was in the Yukon at the time, built a North Adams specific sourdough culture. So you can forage for wild yeast. I have no idea how that works. But she made this sourdough. You could come to the museum, you could get a jar of it. But then she built a bread oven that was placed not at the museum, but within the community, at a community garden. It still exists today. You can get the key from City Hall and bake bread. And it's amazing, and people have embraced it. This also still exists. I love that there's still remnants of these. This is Dean Baldwin, who's an incredible artist from Toronto, who builds social spaces, and he made a chalet, which is a Canadian, lean-to chalet in another building. And we still open it every summer as a beer garden. That extended. I then got commissioned to do a project for the Luminato Festival in Toronto, where I thought, you know, what would happen if I put 12 artists together who have never worked together and asked them to collaborate on a single project? Nothing can go wrong there, right? And I sort of left them to their own devices. And they came up with this, which is a piece called Stockpile. And they were like, you made us make that crane. I was like, you all decided to make that crane. So it's like one of those giant claw machines, but the artists are the claw. And people could move the artists around to get some crap. But the key was, if you didn't win the Tigger, you got the loser certificate, which was a signed letterpress limited edition. We actually had somebody propose using it, and she didn't say yes. It was very awkward. This was a recent foray in Normandy with Laurent Grasso, a Paris-based artist, where he invited me out to his country house, and we went and looked for mushrooms, and then he said to me, how do you feel about trespassing? I was like, let's go. And we traipsed through the woods. It was very thorny, and he took me to this incredible space. And it turns out it was George Brock's studio, which is now abandoned. And then when we got out, I said, do you know there's a road right there? And he was like, yeah, but what fun would the road have been? We took the road back. And then, you know, to me, all of this is about collaboration. Like I said, I don't do anything on my own. And I love to do it. You know, Mass MoCA does as much with performing arts as it does visual arts, and that to me is really important, that we sort of bring those artists together. For Nick's show, it was imperative for him that the show be engaged with, so we held a convening of artists who came right after the show opened, and they were all invited back to produce new work. Bill T. Jones came out of retirement and did a piece there, which was later developed into his piece for the Park Avenue Armory. Nona Hendricks came. I love when I can ask an artist, like, who do you want to engage with? This was another great Trent story where I said, who do you want to do a talk, to write for the catalog, do a performance? And he was naming people, and I was like, those are all easy. I was like, challenge me. And he was like, you're never gonna get my top two. And I was like, well, who are they? And he said, Frank Oz and George Clinton. And clearly, I did it. I remember saying to him, I can get you Frank Oz. I know Frank Oz, voice of Yoda. And he was like, no, you don't. And I was like, okay, next time you come to New York. We had dinner with Frank Oz. Then George Clinton was harder. We just went through his management. We were getting knocked around. We weren't hearing anything. Then we also had a show up that opened before Trent's with the artist Allison Janae Hamilton. Turns out Allison's mother lives next door to George Clinton. I always tell artists, if you don't ask, you don't get yeses. The worst you get is a no, but you would have that if you didn't ask anyway. And I remember Trent was on site doing a mini residency, making work for the show, when I got the call, and I just went down to the basement where he was working, and I said, hey, Trent, we got the funk. And he was like, no way. So George Clinton performed at the opening. That's Allison Janae Hamilton with him as well. And then I also brought in an incredible young rapper named Samus, who also has developed these characters and alter egos, and did interviews with her and Frank for the catalog. And then the other person that Trent was really interested in was Flying Lotus, and we brought Flying Lotus in to do the closing performance for the exhibition. This was a recent thing where I had gotten to know the band Clipping. Clipping is probably most well known as, they're an incredible experimental hip hop band, but probably their most well-known member is David Diggs, who was in Hamilton. And they performed at Mass MoCA, and we connected, and they said, you know, our label Sub Pop is asking us to do these remixes, and we have an idea and thought you might be down for it. We're working with this incredible DJ, turntablist, Maria Chavez, and we want to see if James Turrell will let us record in his spaces. And so James said yes to the recordings. He said maybe to the video. He still has to see it edited. And we spent a week together. The first thing that they did in our Sky space is she broke their entire discography. And Maria has this incredible setup where the heads of her turntables, they actually have a stacked needle so she can play broken records at different levels. And so she broke all of the records, and then we went into our piece called Perfectly Clear, and she remixed all of their discography with David, putting new lyrics over it. And they're working on a sort of immersive performance and film installation now, which hopefully James Turrell will approve of. This was Mark Swanson. I did a show with Mark, who's an artist based in upstate New York. And he has often worked with the performer Jack Ferver. But when I talked to Mark about who he wanted to engage with, he said, Jack and I have such an incredible relationship, but I've always made sets, for Jack's performances. Now I want to make something with Jack in mind for Jack to develop something new. And Jack had not made a new performance in a number of years, and we gave them 2 residencies to develop this new piece called his Global Warming Camp. The whole show was about queerness, climate change, and memorial. And it was incredible, and it was turned into a short film for All Arts. And then most recently, thinking about the Nick Cave model of the convening, I'm working on a big project with Jeffrey Gibson, who was just chosen to be the first Indigenous artist to represent the US at the Venice Biennial. And, Jeff was around for Nick's show, and he said, I want to do something similar, but I really want to collaborate more deeply. I don't want to just offer this site as a site for engagement. And I said, well, let's have the convening a year before the show exists. So in June, we brought together a dozen Indigenous artists, performers, writers, and all given the charge of coming up with proposals to take place in Jeffrey's show, which will open next October. I was just at an event with one of them, Raven Chacon, who's incredible, just won the Pulitzer Prize and a MacArthur Award. And Raven said, I know this community so well, and there were so many people there who I admire who I'd never met before, and you all brought them together for the same time, for the first time. So last 3 slides is just to give you a little sneak peek after all my talking. So what's next? Well, this is, again, sneak peek for sure, rendering of what Jeffrey Gibson is going to be doing with us. And he's actually building a series of 12 by 12 foot stages. They're going to be made out of fused glass of his patterning, along with a number of garments. He's working on a film series that looks at the notion of two-spirit, both historically and with contemporary drag culture. And then the other side of the space will be this bright lit space. All of the garments are going to be able to be lowered for the performers, and the performance program will happen throughout the 18 months of the exhibition. I'm also working on the first large-scale survey of the artist Vincent Valdez's work. Vincent is originally from Texas, is now based between Texas and LA, and really looks at Latin American, US, Mexico in particular, politics. This is a series that he did called The Strangest Fruit, which is based on a series of photos he found of lynchings of Mexican Americans at the US border. And he then cast contemporary friends of his from San Antonio to recreate these moments, but to sort of create them as a kind of ascensions. This is another one of his paintings called So Long, Marianne. This is going to be co-organized with the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, and it's really super thrilling. And then the last, sort of talking about that cross-genre collaboration, I'm working with this great band called Sunlux. So some of you might know them for having done the soundtrack to Everything Everywhere All at Once. And they are incredible. And I've been talking, we have a great sound art sort of collection. I say collection because we don't own anything, but long-term sound works on our campus. And I realized that we had always commissioned artists working with sound, but we had never commissioned musicians. And so I've been talking to them for years about coming to do a site-specific sound installation that will coincide with their next record cycle in 2026, I think it is, 5 or 6, I can't remember anymore. But that brings me to the end. So thank you all for listening, and I look forward to the charcuterie conversation. Have at it.